All right, so for those of you who don't know, Products That Count is a not-for-profit association of people who are interested in product management. We have about 20,000 members on our mailing list, so if you aren't on our mailing list already, please sign up at Products That Count, and you get links to the recordings of all these events, as well as invitations to events that we do here. Our main center is in San Francisco, and many of you have been to events that we do there at Yelp. There's our sponsor up there. We started doing events in the South Bay in San Jose in January, and for this calendar year, our sponsor here is eBay. So they provide the space and the food. Can we get a round of applause for our eBay friends? Tim was most recently at Fitbit, I think employee number 8, so a very early employee. Prior to that was at Twitter, and was at the company before it became Twitter. Does anyone know what the name of that company was? All right.
Well done.
Yeah, nice. Trivia.
That's good trivia.
Yeah, that was
you get
good.
Prizes for that?
More people got that than I thought. And prior to that was at Yahoo and a few other places before that as well. So lots of great experience, and we are all excited to hear from Tim. So over to you, Tim. So we have about a half hour with Tim, and then we have questions and answers.
Awesome, thank you. All right, can you guys hear me? All right, well, thank you all for coming out on is it Tuesday evening, for a quick little discussion about product management stuff. All right, so we're going to talk about launch, which hopefully is a topic that is very near and dear to everybody's heart in this room. Obviously, launching and shipping product is one of the most fundamental key things all of us do. And if we didn't actually launch or ship product, we wouldn't be doing our jobs very well, would we? Thanks very much for the wonderful introduction. It's true, I have done most of those things that Randir claimed. I started off actually getting a bachelor's degree in liberal arts from Vassar College. Anyone here have a liberal arts degree? Oh, wait, we got 1, 2 back there, 3. Not the most common thing in the tech world. There are actually some people out there who are very anti-liberal arts these days in the world of technology, which I would vehemently protest against. I think liberal arts is a great education and background for doing product management because it's very much of a generalist discipline. But when I graduated, all I really wanted to do once I graduated was make and build things. And so I've been doing essentially product management with technology for a good 2.5 decades at this point in time, and learned almost everything that I know on the job by basically doing this, which is launching and shipping product. Because it's my belief that the only way to really learn how to do product management is doing it in the field. There certainly are academic programs that have started to develop over the last number of years. You can read blogs, and you can even listen to people like myself get up and speak over microphones, but the truth is none of that means anything. It's this that teaches you how to actually do product management. Launching and launching and launching, and doing it again, and screwing it up, and screwing it up, and screwing it up until you don't screw it up so much the next time. So, as we go into this discussion today, I want to encourage everybody in the room today and ongoing to think as economists, because I believe that truly in its heart of hearts, product management is a practice and a discipline of being an economist. And what do I mean by that? I believe product management at its core is figuring out how you create value from limited resources. Right? So if you're a product manager, you most likely have some resources at your disposal. Not always, but pretty frequently, that's your team and how they spend their time. And so basically, you get to figure out how those resources that you have, and usually they feel way too limited, and like you don't have enough of them, but how you convert those into actually constructive work, stuff that gets built, that can then get launched, that then ultimately creates value for your company. And so being really good at understanding the frameworks and the economics of how you create maximal value with the limited resources you have is my belief. That's the core and the essence of what product management is about. We like to obsess and think about product development process and features and all the rest of it, but the truth is, at the end of the day, what matters most is that you are creating the most value with the resources that you've got. And the features are just a path to get there. So for when we talk about launch today, let's talk about it in terms of how we might create better returns through better product launches. How do you get better and better doing this process of introducing features and functionality and launching product such that you create better returns for all the effort that goes into it? Now, hopefully many people have heard the phrase of always be shipping. But then I'd also like to introduce rarely be launching. And let's define terms here a little bit about shipping versus launching. And I don't know if this is necessarily a industry adopted thing, but bear with me and let's all embrace this as for this afternoon's discussion, which is shipping is essentially when we're pushing code, when we're delivering features and functionality out to the market. Launching is doing it when we are actually creating a story and doing a messaging event, a big messaging event, and packaging together a bunch of capabilities that we want to push out to our users. And so you should always be shipping, and I'm a big fan of continuous deployment and being able to actually be frequently putting features and iterating and doing continuous iteration around stuff. And I'm also a big fan of when you need to be doing launching. But to do a big product launch is expensive, and these things can really run at odds with each other. I don't know, has anyone else in the room experienced this where on one hand, you really want to subscribe to the practices of iterating and continuous improvement and refining features and being able to learn what users like and tweak them and being able to do that really fast in an agile manner, be able to ship features just as soon as they're ready and being able to push out kind of the bare essence of an MVP, learn from it and tweak it. But then, if you want to do a launch, and you want to have press around the thing, and you want to have user communications, well, how do you bundle all those together such that anyone pays attention to your launch? And trying to do both of those are kind of incongruous. And it's hard to do them at the same time. So when we talk today, we're going to be talking mostly about launching, but we also want to talk a little bit about how we manage that with always being shipping. And so one of the things I think is important here and what I've found over the years is when you look at your roadmap, your stuff on your roadmap should go into two buckets. It should go into the stuff that is just can be shipping and then the stuff that is launching. What's the stuff in your roadmap that it doesn't have to actually go out with a big story and a big message? It doesn't have to have that tax and that cost that goes on top of it. It's the stuff that you can actually, the features you can leak out quietly, learn from, and just innovate on. And what is the stuff that actually needs to go out with a big story on it? And you probably want to have a couple of these big launches a year, and you want to figure out what that narrative and that story is for doing those launches. And I would argue that you want to make sure that the stuff goes into those launches that is necessary to support those narratives, but nothing more. And the rest of the stuff you want to put into kind of really lightweight, being able to do frequent shipping on top of. But being able to structure it that way and understand what has to go into a launch and what doesn't have to go into a launch is a really important way to filter through your roadmap. So, and what we're going to do here is just jump through a bunch of different kind of concepts or things for thinking about launches. And I'm going to go through these relatively quick, and then we're going to transition to just kind of Q&A and being able to discussion. And I very intentionally, you'll see none of this is really about Fitbit, none of this is about fitness, none of this is about hardware. I want to keep this relatively high level in general. But I'm also happy to do lots of Q&A around Fitbit hardware specific, fitness specific stuff as a follow-on to this and the Q&A. So, all right, now let's talk about, as you're working on launches and product initiatives, how do you set those up for success? And this is something that I think for many people in the room will be a little bit of a head nod. Yeah, of course, you should always do this. But it's one of those things that you continuously product people drop to the side as they focus a lot on the product that's being built. But if we go back to that statements that we made earlier about economics, defining early in the beginning, having crystal clear vision on what your KPIs are is fundamental. Because that's where you're defining what is the value that you're creating. What are you trying to get out of this product initiative? What are the features that you're doing that purchase what value for you? And so starting at the very beginning of any initiative as you're planning for a launch and being really crystal clear about your KPIs is fundamental. And it's fundamental that not only do you define them really clearly, It's that you have the team understand them really clearly. It's that, and then you also define not just what the KPIs are, but that the goals around them are also very clear. And that's probably the hardest part. Because, right, like if you're talking about doing a project, you're talking about launching a feature, understanding and knowing what the impact of that feature is going to be, knowing what results it's going to produce is a little bit of a black art. It's a little bit of a tough thing to understand. So my recommendation is really thinking about thresholds and threshold analysis. So let's say you're doing a feature that you think is going to drive user engagement. And let's say your KPI is something around app opens or some usage of the feature. Well, what's the threshold at which that makes sense to do, at which this feature makes sense? And you can say, well, like at the extremes, well, if it had 100% increase in engagement, absolutely we would do this feature. And you could say, well, if it did 0.01%, we would never do this feature. Well, so there's a threshold in there somewhere where that economically makes sense. So I really encourage you as you think about projects to define these KPIs and to really think through in an anticipatory way, what are the thresholds where these actually merit and make sense and justify economically. And doing that up front so that you don't have to start figuring that out post-launch, because usually what happens if you do it post-launch is you kind of retrofit the KPIs and your thresholds to the reality of what's happening. But you want to actually do that in an anticipatory way. Keeping your finger on the pulse. So if the KPI definition is really important and critical in the beginning of the process, what's then really necessary is being great at keeping your finger on the pulse of the product and how it performs once the product goes live. And I say this because I know I've screwed this one up a number of times before. At Fitbit, we had a product that we launched, and we had another product deliverable queued up right after it, and we had to move very fast on working onto that next initiative. And what happened is that we're about maybe 3 or 4 months after launching that first product and realized that we had massive problems with that product in market that we're completely unaware of. And it was a little bit of an existential question for us. Like, how did this happen? How did we end up having a product in market for months with massive defect issues and big problems and not even be aware of it? And you know, we were probably a 40-person company at the time. We were relatively small. But it forced us to step back and say, how do you develop the muscles and the skills to never let that happen again? And so we developed a practice at Fitbit called Pulse. And what Pulse was, is we said anytime a launch is going to happen, you figure out what's the key assembly of the cross-functional team you need to manage and monitor that launch. And not just make the launch happen, but to keep your finger on that product for as long as it takes till you know it's really stable and performing in the market. And so at Fitbit, a cross-functional team was very cross-functional, right? Because you have, you know, product people, you have your data analytics people, you have customer support, you have hardware reliability people, you have operations and manufacturing people, you have a very broad set of people, you know, firmware engineering, you have systems operations and server operations. You have a really complex system that all needs to work together. Because often when you're looking at a problem that's happening, it's a very big stack of where all those problems could be coming from. And so what we would do is you'd start dry running that Pulse meeting of everyone getting together and looking at your key dashboards and your data and making sure that your dashboards work, that you have confidence in the data that you've got, and you're looking at that stuff before the launch even happens. We actually had our analytics team run the meeting. And eventually we transitioned to where we actually had product be more involved. But I really liked it when analytics ran the meeting because they're kind of agnostic. They're kind of like, we're the guys here with the data to show you what's happening. It's up to everyone else in the room to figure out what to do about it. We're just the ones to try to give you the clearest perspective on reality that we can. But in that meeting, then what would happen is you would see very clearly as issues would bubble up. And they could come from many different places, whether it was supply chain or customer support or channel out of the retail customers. And those issues then, we would be able to then put and swarm teams onto really fast. So we would do this Pulse meeting every single day. We would dry run it before launch, and then post-launch, we would do it every single day. And we would do it every single day until you knew you didn't need to do it every single day. And that would be pretty self-evident. And then we would start to move to doing it 3 days a week, to down to 1 day a week, and then it would phase out. But that meeting always ended with, What's the task list of who needs to deal with what issues? And they've got 24 hours to come back and report on that. And so we went from a phase where we were launching products and having defects in market for months without knowing it, to once you put this process in place, it's unbelievable how fast things get stabilized and fixed in market and prevents that from ever happening again. And this kind of segues nicely into the last point, which is budgeting for the post-launch surprises. I think I can safely say that every single launch that I've done, and there's been many of them over the years, always has some kind of surprise that hits you after launch. It's almost impossible to anticipate everything that's going to happen, whether they're technical issues, whether they're usability issues, or customer issues, or market issues. You just can't, it's a too complex a world to control. And the mistake that is easiest to make is to think that you've got the bandwidth to go on and do lots of new stuff once you get this project done. And so it's really important as a product manager, as the person who's the economist here, the person who's controlling the budget, to say, I am actually earmarking a bunch of budget, a bunch of my team's time, for right after launch to do stuff. And to do stuff that I don't even know what it is yet. And so usually what that looks like is there's some stuff that you know. You know that you're going to have some bug cleanup, and you know that you've got some feature polish and some things that didn't get done that you need to get done after launch. But I'm not talking about that stuff. And I think you should plan for that stuff to get done. But you also need to set the team's expectations, your stakeholders, your executive expectations, that we're not signing up for a bunch of new stuff in the next number of weeks, month, right after launch. Number one priority is us supporting this product when it goes live. And stuff is going to happen. And so, if in some miraculous world, all of you are able to do launches that actually never have a surprise that comes, first of all, call me up, because I'd love to hear that story. But if it doesn't happen, if you don't have those surprises, well, then you've got your team still working on bug cleanup, stabilization, tech deck, product debt, feature polish, et cetera, which is stuff that you should be doing anyway. And then you can transfer more quickly onto new initiatives than you expected. But more likely what's going to happen is that you're going to end up with a little bit of a blend of the proactive stuff you wanted to do and a whole bunch of reactive stuff that pops up. But what you want to make sure is that you planned for that, you anticipated that, you set the team up successfully to be able to handle that stuff versus being thrown into a reactive mode. So these were just, as I prepared for today, these were kind of top things that I thought popped to mind of less obvious, some of the more interesting things that over the years have come up for me in doing successful launches. So I thought I would start with those, but then you really use that as a segue to open up the floor for questions and do Q&A. So thank you all for joining in and for the quick amount of time on that, and let's just transition that to kind of a discussion forum.
You're gonna get some
Yep, Tina? Start with Tina over there.
Yeah. Hello? Hello? Sorry, talk loud. Yeah, talk loud. So I was wondering, after a launch, like you mentioned budgeting for the unknown, critical errors and fixing all of that stuff. How do you maintain the momentum after the launch? Besides just production support and maintenance, make this big feature announcement, new product launch, and customers want to see incremental improvements to that feature. Yet you're competing with other parts of the product that now have gained priority. So how do you maintain that momentum after the launch?
And so, Tina, thank you. It's a great question. Let me repeat the question for everybody in case you couldn't hear it, which is, all right, so you get a launch done, you've budgeted some time for your cleanup work. How do you maintain momentum? How do you, so you've launched this feature or this area, how do you maintain a certain amount of momentum on it, especially given all the competing priorities that exist within the organization? Is that a fair restatement?
Yes.
And so, I've definitely had this question before of I've got so many apples and oranges, competing priorities. How do you possibly rationalize all of that? How do you come up with a plan on that? And how do you also have the new shiny objects that show up in the organization not come at the expense of deserting the product that you just, or the feature that you just launched? because it's kind of a crime when it happens, right? Especially because you do all this effort to get a product or a feature or something launched. Usually you've gotten about 90% of the effort in on that thing that you wanted. And the truth is that last 10% of effort is the highest ROI work you could do, right? Because you've done all the heavy lifting and the hard work to get this feature to a state where it could be launched. And the amount of returns you can get on the polishing and momentum and updating of that feature can sometimes be way more than moving off to the next shiny object. And so a lot of this, I think, is around organizational expectations. So two ways to answer that question. One is around organizational expectation setting, which is being able to have clarity about what you want to continue to do in terms of momentum on that product, being able to tell a story about how you should continue to invest in that product, and being able to get people to understand the economics of why the investment in that product ongoing, why the polishing of it, why the iterating of it, why the pulling in of those features that didn't get done, why those are things you should continue to invest in versus new shiny stuff. And then to the larger question of like, well, how do you even know when it's time to stop on this feature and then go move on to the next shiny object is also a good one. And I think, again, thinking about these things economically is the most fundamental and the best way to do it. So you've got a limited amount of resources. Let's say you've got a specific team you're responsible for. Well, is that team's effort and time and the amount of time they spend on those features, and when you do a basic, let's face it, we don't have perfect data as product managers. Like when we say we're going to do an ROI analysis, we don't have real solid data most of the time of what the exact returns are, what the exact costs are, right? It'd be great if that were the case, but we're operating much more in the world of heuristics and fuzzy logic of like, all right, when I squint my eyes, which of these seems to be a better deal? How much does this cost, and what value am I going to get out of continuing to iterate on this thing? What's the value and what's the cost out of this thing? And this is why liberal arts is a great background for product managers, right? Because there is a lot of abstract thinking, and it isn't a pure mathematical equation. And so that's where it's part science, but product management, I believe, is also art. And you're going to have to trust your gut and be able to look at that and balance those different inputs to figure out which produces the best result, and then sell it. Yep.
So you're employee number 8 at Fitbit. What did you learn? What mistakes did you make early on in Fitbit that stick with you today?
How much time do we have?
We can just do one.
So one of the things that I think I was really fortunate about in terms of being at Fitbit and being able to go from 8 employees to 2,000 employees and go through IPO and et cetera, is I got to longitudinally go from a tiny little startup team to that team going through the process of mitosis and splitting up into its first level of multiple teams, to then many more teams, to the many more teams, and being able to go all the way from the beginning to the end on that till when we had, just on software alone, 29 Agile teams running in parallel on a scaled Agile framework. And I think I was very, very fortunate to be in the position to be able to see how that evolves. And I'll say the first mistake that just kind of pops to mind was when we made that first transition. So we were one team, and we kind of hit that moment where we all sat back and said, okay, now we've gotten too big to be one team anymore. You know, you're doing stand-up, and people are falling asleep during stand-up because there's half the stuff that's being talked about is irrelevant to what they're doing. And we're like, all right, clearly this is not efficient. We need to actually structure development teams into multiple teams, our team into multiple teams. And so I drove that process, and I said, all right, we're basically split up into feature teams that were structured around features or areas of functionality, but where the intention was to make those as autonomous as possible. So you were going to have iOS engineering, Android engineering, server engineering, front-end web engineering, design, product, all put together into one team owning a specific area. Which, it's great, right? What could go wrong with that? What the problem was is that we were not big enough to be able to truly achieve that. Like we had, I think, 2 or 3 iOS engineers. And so engineering revolted. There was like mutiny. They were like, no way, we're not doing that. They completely refused. We sat down to roll the whole thing out, and engineering, specifically iOS engineering, was like, no way, we're not doing it. Our code base for the iPhone app is a piece of crap. There's so much work that needs to be done on it. If you take the 2 or 3 iPhone engineers we have and spread them up into little teams over here, it's just going to become a bigger piece of crap. We're not doing it. And so now when I look at it retrospectively, I think that there is a very common evolution process of how a single team splits into many teams. And it starts off as this one super generalist team. And then I think it's very natural to go to what are more platform-based teams, where you have an iPhone team and an Android team and a web team and a server team, and you kind of get those working together. And you're still small enough that that's easy to do with not a lot of overhead and process. And then you do that for a while, and then that thing eventually crashes and burns and doesn't work anymore. And then you can actually move into doing more of the feature team type stuff that I tried to do too early in the process. So there's one.
I'm an intern, and I'm in research. But something I've been learning as I talk to more PMs, which I think is really interesting, is it sounds like being a PM is being a jack of all trades. You are an influencer among different stakeholders. You are also trying to communicate to a team of developers and probably a lot of other teams about how to accomplish like certain goals that you have on your roadmap. You're also a planner. You're planning out the year or the quarter or whatever, and budgeting enough time as well as budgeting like money and for resources. So it sounds like PMs do a lot, but how does a PM focus? How does a PM sort of like know how to budget their time in the right places, and how have you grown, and what's your magic special sauce?
Sure. So I'll just repeat the question quickly, which is, for product managers, it's a great question. For product managers, it sounds like product managers have to do a myriad of different tasks and activities. How do you possibly prioritize all the stuff that's going on as a product manager and know what to be working on at one given point in time? For me, product management, always what has made it exciting is how dynamic it is, and I feel like Lee over here and I were just chatting earlier that part of what makes product management exciting is that it's a hot seat job. Like whatever problem is going on, and there's always a problem, as a product manager, you're always somehow stuck in the middle of it. Doesn't matter if servers are crashing or if there was some kind of big competitive issue that just blew up in the market, or if a schedule is way off or whatever it is, you're in the middle of it. And so, there is, I think, a certain uncanny skill for a product manager of being able to understand within the given context of all the stuff that's going on, how do you delegate and put your time, how do you distribute your time across that? I don't know if I have a magic answer of how you do that. I feel like for me professionally, it always ends up being somewhat self-evident. I think the thing that ends up being hardest is there's always so much urgent and important stuff going on that it's always sometimes hard to make sure you're getting the important, non-urgent stuff done. And so the ways that I guess the tools that I've used over the years, I do personal time management in a way that's very similar. It's a kind of a weird mix of agile and getting things done, or GTD. I've kind of munged those together in a way where I basically figure out what I need to get done on a daily basis, and I replan my day every single day in a way that allows me to kind of really create a forcing function on how I spend my time and make sure I get the important stuff done. So like I'll take things that are really important but not urgent, but I know I need to get done, and I'll put them at the front of my top of my list, and I won't let myself get to the other stuff until I get that important stuff done. So I create kind of self-disciplined forcing functions. I would say that I think just as a product manager, that's part of the joy. I think it's part of the excitement, which is just you end up in the middle of the hurricane all the time of the stuff that's going on. Yep.
You mentioned earlier those iOS developers were pissed about the code base. My question is, as a product manager, what's your responsibility in the mid-long term to make sure the code base is kind of, the technology is great besides hiring great engineers?
Yep. Well, so as a liberal arts person, I'm not an engineer. Couldn't write a line of code to save my life. I can't even say line of code, save my life. And there are people who think that product managers should be very technical. I actually think that being a non-technical product manager can be an enormous asset, right? Because ultimately, I mean, the truth is, I don't care if the code base is a good code base. I don't care if we have tech debt or don't have tech debt. I care about the business impact of that. And so the truth is that I've worked with technology enough to know that you need to do investments in your code base. You need to make sure that you have a stable code base. You need to do to remove tech debt. You need to actually have good test coverage. You need to be able to invest in these things if you care about actually having reliable, predictable, fast product development. And I might not care at all about tech debt, but I can tell you I care enormously about reliable, predictable, fast product development. And so I think that the trust between engineering and product is really, really important. If you've ever been in an environment or a company where there's an antagonistic relationship between product and engineering, it sucks, right? Like you're on the same team. And so I want to be able to have a really honest conversation with engineering of like, okay, you want to do a 3 sprints worth of tech debt cleanup. Well, let's talk through, like, explain to me, why is that important? And and is it all really critical? And really justify for me why tech debt cleanup is important. Not because I don't believe you, but because if I'm the one that's responsible for the economics of making sure we're investing stuff in the short term, in the long term, and we're doing that appropriately, I need to understand what we're spending our time on. So help me really understand. Like, it's horrible to be able to say, okay, either I don't believe you, so we're not going to do it, or I'm going to give you a blank check because I don't understand it. None of those work. You want to have a really good, honest conversation. And I may not be an engineer, but I know technology enough to be able to have a salient conversation about it, a good conversation around things like re-architecting or improving the platform. And so, but I want to be able to translate that not just into creating nice, elegant code for the sake of elegant code. I want to know the results it's going to give us as a team. Because ultimately, engineers and product managers can't succeed in spite of each other. They can only succeed with each other. And so you want to have very strong, good relationships between them. Mm-hmm.
Your point on shipping instead of launching, I completely agree on that, and just wanted your your thoughts on sometimes, I mean, and MVP as well. Sometimes MVP is taken too literally, and you don't care about user experience. And then there's other terms of empathy and creating products that people love and people awesome products. How do you balance, like, because if you want to do that, and then you sometimes only have one chance to create an impression, and if you screw that up, whatever you do later on, no one's going to care about it. And then a lot of times decisions are based on the first, the iteration, and if the results are not good, you're not even going to have time or resources to invest further. How do you balance all of that when you say shipping, or because they're...
So just to paraphrase, so shipping, launching, how do you balance between the two? How do you know how to actually figure out how much of it you should be doing as shipping, how much you should do as launching? How do you know when you should be doing truly just an MVP and then iterating on it, as well as how do you know when you should be trying to make a big fancy splash? Is that fair as a paraphrase?
Fancy, but at least, like, instead of just being an MVP, it has to be a little more like something between an MVP to a big fancy.
So I intentionally tried to stay away from almost even talking about MVP in the deck, in part because I have a little bit of an ambivalent feeling towards it. I feel like MVP can, if not done right, be a very quick path towards mediocrity. Because often what happens is you do the MVP, which works if you then do a really good job of continuing to focus and iterate on the MVP. But instead, what often happens is you do the MVP, and then people go off to the next shiny object. And then you just end up with this thing that was never meant to be the end-all product. It was just supposed to be the start. And you end up with a lot of those lying around, and it just creates an enormous amount of product debt. Now I've got all these like half-baked kind of MVP things that never really, and teams hate this, right? People are like, wait, you just told me, like I was uncomfortable launching that MVP thing to start with, but we all got comfortable because we were just gonna do it as an MVP, and then we were gonna iterate on the thing and get it to where it needed to be based on getting customer feedback. And then as soon as we launched it, you pulled me off onto some other shiny object project, and now we've got that thing lying around. Like, everyone goes home at night feeling like, oh, that sucks, and I wish we got to finish that thing. We had great ideas on it. So part of it is really kind of the budget aspect, and I think is also getting people to understand and commit organizationally, and actually having on your roadmap, okay, if this is the MVP, well, show me on your roadmap what you're doing around that MVP for the months afterwards. And show me that you're budgeting and committing resources and time to iterating and testing features and improving that thing. And again, not every feature needs to be done that way, because that MVP approach is not going to work for the launch where you want to go have, out to the press and have 20 different press people cover it. So you just have to, and you can't mix the two very easily. They're kind of like oil and water. And so you just have to decide which ones, which features, which initiatives are going to go into which approach. And how do you know which go into which approach? I mean, I think that there's a bunch of variables. One, when you look at it from a outbound marketing messaging perspective, what's the narrative that you want to tell? And your public launch features should support that narrative and that arc. Right? So if the arc at Fitbit was, we are dramatically changing sleep functionality, well, are there a couple big launches during the year that really drive that? Hardware, software, integrated together, big moments, because you can only go out and talk to the press a couple times to be able to achieve that. But then, what's the roadmap that allows the quiet, iterative, because the truth is that the innovation is almost easier to do on the quiet, iterative stuff. The other variable I would say is, I hate doing the big risky stuff in those big product launches, right? Whether it's risky technically or whether it's risky in terms of customer acceptance, right? Because you're going out in this big launch, the thing has a lot of risk to it, and you're putting a spotlight on it on day one. It's just a great way to step in it and have everybody watch at the same time. And so, but it's tough because often your marketing department is going to want that stuff to be part of your big launch. So it's a lot of negotiation to kind of figure out how you thread the needle on those.
Two questions, Tim. The first question is, what technology or emerging technology are you personally passionate about or bullish about? Right? That's the first question.
Yep.
The second question is to existing product managers here or aspiring PMs here. How do you stay sharp in a world where there's so many, stuff out there, a lot of noise in your silo? How do you stay competitive and on the edge in your domain expertise from a product manager perspective? What advice could you offer?
Cool. Those are both awesome questions. So two-part question. One, what technologies and things happening am I excited about? And two, how do you stay sharp and on it as a product manager, especially when your head's down in your own little product world a lot of the time? On the first one, I'm going to answer it not so much in terms of technology, but I guess more of kind of opportunities or spaces around innovation. Fitbit, I think we did an awesome job of telling people what they did. Right? Capturing data, having low power sensors, capturing that data and reflecting it back to people so people understood what they did. One of the things I think is still a huge opportunity in the world is using that data and using the increasing amounts of data that we have on people to tell people what they can or should do differently to achieve health and fitness results. That I think there's enormous opportunity to provide coaching, guidance, and help for people that removes the cognitive load of how to actually be healthier from the individual and allows technology to help achieve that for people. That I think, especially as technology becomes better and better at leveraging all of that data and creating user experiences that give people clear guidance, I think that's an enormous opportunity across a ton of different spaces. And when you think about like when people go to the gym, going to the gym. If you watch, most people when they go to the gym, if you watch what happens is they walk in the gym, they look around, they kind of glance at the free weight equipment, which totally freaks them out, and they kind of wander over to the Stairmaster and get on the Stairmaster for half an hour and watch TV and then sneak back out. Because it's too complicated, it's too much cognitive load. What the hell am I supposed to do? Is a million different decisions, etc. Like, if you look at something like Peloton, part of what makes Peloton a great product is I get on the Peloton, I make one single decision, and I get off 45 minutes later, and I had an amazing workout, and all I had to do was make one stupid decision, was to get on the bike. Just get on the bike. And so I think where technology can actually help people relieve the cognitive load, because exercise and fitness sucks. And it's uncomfortable, people generally don't like doing it, and so if you can help people, make it easier for them, and where technology can make it help people more, I think that's an enormous opportunity. So if anyone in the room ends up being excited about that stuff, come talk to me about it, because I think that's a fascinating space. And the second question, I've thought about, had a lot of conversations with people about career management as a product manager, and I've done in ways an awful job of it for myself personally. But I'm going to give you the advice for what I did for myself, because I guess it turned out okay. Which is, I think that your career, and you become an amazing product manager through your product. And the best possible thing you can do as a product manager is ship amazing freaking products. And if you ship amazing products that change the world and are incredibly successful, you will have a fantastic career. You will see, I was in charge of product and marketing at Odeo. I have user ID number 6 or 8 or something for Twitter, and I think that's my second one that I had. You'll see, I don't use Twitter. I don't do much for being out in the world and self-promotion or any of that stuff. All I spent my career doing, honestly, was trying to make a great frickin' product. And I believe that if I made a really great product, that the rest would happen naturally. And so the biggest advice that I would give anyone as a product manager professionally is don't worry about your career. Worry about becoming the best possible person, to making the best possible product you can, and then everything else flows from that. Mm-hmm. Oh, sorry. No.
So the question regarding software-only products and hardware software products. And you have experience with both of them. And from a Fitbit point of view, what were your biggest surprises or learnings when it came to hardware?
Mm-hmm.
Lessons.
Sure. That's another question where, again, we could probably spend hours going through that one, because I had never really done hardware before going to Fitbit. The two co-founders had never done hardware. So it was one of those classic examples of sometimes you're better off not knowing, not knowing what you don't know, because otherwise you wouldn't do it. I don't think I knew what firmware was before I started at Fitbit. So I had an enormous learning curve of figuring out the world of hardware and mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, and firmware, and all the rest of it at Fitbit, which is part of what made it such an amazing experience. I'd say I like to think about making products as a craft, as a very much of a social human art of how people work together to create things. And the nature of how you make a hardware product versus how you make a software product are so different. And how you actually get an organization and teams and people working together when the substrate and the matter of how they make things is so different was a really hard problem to solve. And I would say we never solved it. And I don't think it is solvable. I think it's a really, really hard, complex issue of when you've got, the conversations where, the hardware roadmap says, okay, we've got this product that's hitting the market in 18 months to 24 months, and we're doing feature lockdown within the next 3 to 6 months. So we're going to all the software teams saying feature lockdown is coming up in 3 to 6 months, and you have to have that figured out. And the software teams are like, wait, you want us to lock down our features a year to 18 months from now? What are you talking about? We're thinking about the next 3 sprints. Like, so how you actually get that working culturally and how you create processes and systems, especially at scale, especially when you've got, 29 agile software teams and you've got 6 different hardware program teams, and you're fostering a culture and environment where you want to push down decision making and let those teams figure that stuff out, was very elusive and very, very hard, but fascinating and really exciting.
Hey Tim, thanks for being here and sharing your wisdom with us. I run a medical technology startup and we're coming close to launching our product. And the big question I face is, what do I do with my AA engineers who've developed a beautiful product? Because there's a wave 2 coming for us, which is the second line of product that I'll have to put them on. But those are the guys that know my current product well and probably need to be at least partly on the launch team, as you said. So in this situation, for an early company, how do you budget and plan with a mix of existing and new people on the launch team? Can you speak about that?
So when you say engineers, what type of engineering are you talking about? Because certainly one of the things we experience, and this is a great segue out of your question, which is one of the big differences you see is like, when you hit product launch, like the mechanical engineers are like, they've been gone for months. They're off onto new things. They're out of there, right? But like and then your firmware engineers are somewhere in the middle, and like your server engineers, they're like the game just started. Like the things are just lighting up. And so which type of engineering matters a lot in terms of where they are in that process?
For me, it's likely going to be electrical/firmware and the cloud software folks that will have to stay plugged in. Mostly the software guys, because of the infrastructure and all that. The mechanical guys, like you said, we're going to hear about it from the customer when something breaks, right? It's physical. So, well, that's the mix now. Back to you.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that from when you're talking about essentially software or embedded systems and firmware and that stuff, I do think that you really want to have those hands on deck when launch happens, right? Those are, especially those categories, are some of the most important people to be able to triage when stuff goes wrong. So when you're in that launch war room, when you're in the pulse room, and you are seeing that customer support issues are coming in with some kind of display issue, like those are going to be people, like those people, and like also, supply chain people end up being really important too, because you're like, all right, do we have a hardware issue that ended up happening here? Was this a software issue? Like that type of triaging becomes pretty important. You don't necessarily need everybody, but you need to have some representation of those people, and you don't want to have to, you want that response to be immediate. You don't want to have like, an issue came up and like, that person's 110% off into some other world, and you have to go negotiate, and you're a small company, so some of these are easier changes to make when you're at a bigger, when you got to be Fitbit bigger size, getting someone pulled out of a project back into another project came with more overhead. I'm assuming if you're a relatively small startup, some of those shifts are like a 30-second conversation and they're back into a higher priority. It's easier to do. But I do think having people's, especially your first product launch, like it's arguably one of the most important events for the entire life cycle of your company. Even when you are public and 2,000 people 6 years from now, that first product launch is probably the most influential launch event of the entire company. And so making sure that thing goes right is just critical. So I would over-index on ensuring the success there, even if that comes at the expense a little bit of the next gen.
We have time for one last question there. And then Tim will be around for a few more minutes, so we can certainly ask questions one-on-one. But we'll have one last question there.
So my question is, it's a little bit more about going back to the early days of Fitbit. There weren't a lot of wearables. It was still relatively nascent, market at the time. How did you go about identifying that customer need, that people actually wanted something like a Fitbit? And even in terms of the physical product, as well as some of the, the software features that came around. Like one of the things that I really loved was, being able to track my sleep. How well did I sleep? I don't know why I wanted to track that, but it was just a cool thing to have. And it kept me coming back into the app again and again and again. Wondering how you guys went about thinking about those early need states when you went to build this.
Yep. So question is, how do we, for a bunch of the early features of Fitbit, how do we decide, because it was such a new technology and a new capability, how do we decide what to go do? I think one of the fundamental premises that we had was using data and sensors to reveal that which was hidden. And the first time that I used a Fitbit, I was a big runner, I was really active. If you had asked me, all right, on a scale of 1 to 10, how active are you? I'd be like, well, no, I'm not a professional athlete or anything. I'm probably like a 7 or an 8. And then I used a Fitbit for about 24 hours, and I had to face the cold, hard reality of the data of Fitbit, which said I was completely sedentary. Like, I would go running 3 times a week, but guess what? Running 3 times a week doesn't make up for sitting in front of a computer and sitting in conference rooms for the rest of that time and then getting in your car and driving home. And I was like, how often do you have a product that changes the way you think about yourself? And I would argue that that revelation was not unique to me. Many people who have used Fitbits have gone through that experience. And it changed the way that I behaved, and it changed the way that I thought about myself and my own behavior. And it's done that for now millions and millions of people. And I believe the essence of that was you use data to reveal something that otherwise was hidden, similar to sleep. Very few people understand much about their sleep. And the idea that you can use data to actually understand more about yourself and reveal that was hidden is very, very powerful. And I think that those mechanics, those hooks of how you can use data, were things that we were really curious about and thought could have a lot of impact. And I think those were really important and impactful to the product experience. And we then took those moments and we tried to explode them. So like the idea that when you hit 10,000 steps, that you would, so the goal celebration was a big deal for us. We thought goal celebration was such an important thing. So when you hit your 10,000 steps, that the device would actually start vibrating on your wrist. It was like this moment of surprise and delight. It's like a very simple product moment, but it became like this branded experience for Fitbit. And I remember the UX designer who came up with it and said, like, hey, we should have the thing vibrate and just start buzzing when you hit your 10,000 steps. People freaking loved it. It was the best thing ever, because it had such a surprise to it. And so I think those were things that were just these small things that seemingly don't seem like they were that big a deal, were just astronomically important to the overall success of the product.
Thanks so much, Tim.
Yep. Awesome. Thank you so much. Right on.
For coming all the way. So I felt bad enough that we pulled Tim from San Francisco, but he reminded me that today he didn't come from San Francisco, he came from Sausalito. So I should feel worse. But thanks for coming.
Yeah, my pleasure.